Hello tea friends. We thought we'd make another video about one of our recent acquisitions, one of the teas we found recently, because there is a lot to discuss and learn from, and we want to continue to make this content to provide educational value to some of the teas that we find so that they aren't just pleasurable experiences that you enjoy or ceremonial teas that have great energy or create meditative space, but that there's also things that you can learn about tea through the drinking of them, because the best, I think, tea lessons are when you can like geek out on some kind of information, but then you also have the opportunity to experience how that information plays out by drinking the tea or using a particular type of teaware or doing your own comparisons and understanding in a experiential way. That's when it really like lands and when it's so much more enjoyable. So I wanted to introduce this really special tea called Wind in the Pines. It's very unique. This is a 1960s or early 70s Sencha. So a lot of amazing, cool things to think about. A Sencha that's like 50 years old. And it's Taiwanese. So there's a lot of mystery and a lot of really cool aspects to this and a lot of cool things to discuss. As usual, I don't have answers. I just have questions and invitations to explore areas of exploration that you can pursue and hopefully learn about, and then maybe drink this tea and combine some experience with some data. So the first cool thing about this tea is its vintage. A lot of loose leaf teas don't have vintages. They can't really be accurately dated, and there's a lot of Paul Bunyanism. So this person sells it as 80s, and then this person sells it as late 70s, and then the next person sells it, and it's like the age is growing like a tall tale. And I've experienced that firsthand, but there's no way to really know when a loose leaf tea came from, be it a Pu'er or be it a Taiwanese tea. It's very rare. There has to be some kind of circumstance that allows you to date it, that surrounds it. Like, for example, Disco, a tea that we have that has some you could say, dateability. In fact, I think in Pu'er, some of what you're paying for, not all, but some of what you're paying for when you get a cake versus like an old loose leaf tea is the vintage. You're paying for something that can be dated and we know when it was from. Maybe not down to the year, but we can get like a range and be much more accurate. Whereas loose leaf teas, sometimes they have stuff added to them over time, so it's not even 100% pure, or there's the Paul Bunyanism and the age is just whatever somebody says it is, and it's really hard to know. You can kind of, if you start drinking a lot of aged oolong or aged Pu'er, that's loose leaf, and you drink a lot of them, and then you also drink a lot of teas that you know the vintage of, then over time through experience you can start to roughly map them. I've talked about this in previous videos. I think I mentioned it in the Disco video when I mentioned why that tea is important, because teas like that allow us to get a really much more accurate date then become like reference points, like pins on a map in our experience. So in the case of Pu'er, if you start drinking a lot of vintages, if you have experience drinking 30s tea, 50s tea, 60s tea, 70s tea, 80s tea, nowadays a lot of people don't have those experiences because those teas are astronomically expensive. Then some of us were fortunate. It's just the sheer luck of getting into this a little bit earlier, and when those things were a little bit cheaper and more prevalent, and you start to drink anyway as much of that as you can. If you can't drink 30s and 50s and 70s and whatever, nowadays you could drink 2000 and late 90s and early 90s maybe, and you could drink some 2003 and 4 and 5, and you start to like just drink different teas that have more verifiable age, and those put like pins on the map. And then you start to drink a lot of loose leaf teas, and you'll be able to kind of map them, kind of be able to say like this one is similar to the 80s show cakes I've had. I'd probably put it around there. But because also something to remember is that, like in the case of Pu'er, loose leaf tea ages quicker. It changes more rapidly. So, if the tea has the texture, feeling, taste maybe, or some other profile similar to a late 80s cake that you know. It might be that it's early 90s, etc. So, but you do start to get like a rough kind of field like that. So teas that, loose leaf teas that have some kind of circumstance that creates vintage are really unique. And in some genres, they can be very helpful because they become like pins that help us to get experiential wisdom, to get a kind of, you could say like just markers and of different dates and what the teas taste like when they change. Of course, the other cool aspect of that in genres like aged oolong and pu'er and other teas like this is not only are we getting like points that we can use to then evaluate the age of teas we're not sure about, but we're also learning about how to age our own tea and what happens when we age our own tea. The only way to really understand how to age any tea is to age it, so to have experience of watching it change over a long period of time, but also to drink lots of samples of well-aged teas. When you drink lots of samples of well-aged teas and you combine that with experience of aging tea over, at least decades, that's when you start to get like, those are the types of people that I want to ask questions about when I want to ask about, how I should age my tea. So the other thing about finding teas that have a vintage, be it because they're a cake or a loose leaf that has some kind of circumstantial reference point that allows us to date it, means that we can do these two things. We can learn about aging and we can start to get experience about what different ages look like, and then map new teas to that as well. This one's a little bit unique because it's a sencha, it's a green tea. And so it doesn't really work in those two ways because we're not, most of us, exploring either lots of aged green teas or how to age green tea ourselves. So, it doesn't really map up in those ways. But it's still cool that it has a reference point. And the reason it has a reference point is because after World War II, Taiwanese were actually exporting a lot of sencha to Japan. And then that ended in the early 70s. It ended. And there's different versions of why, but basically the Japanese cut it off. And some say, some Taiwanese like to brag and say that the Taiwanese sencha was better than the Japanese at the time. It certainly was more expensive. And so there was maybe that reason. There's other reasons why, who knows all the reasons or what really happened. But the point is that the market kind of ended. And it did disrupt the Taiwanese tea farming economy a little bit. But it also turned out in the end to be a good thing because it forced farmers to start focusing on producing a little bit higher quality teas for the domestic market, and things started improving, at least in some areas. But that was the end of the sencha. But there was sencha produced in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s for export to Japan. You'll notice when you look at this tea that it's rougher than the sencha that you're used to drinking now, which is very fine little like needles that are made from all buds. This is a more coarse tea. This is more similar to what would be like a striped green tea today, like a baozhong, or which is we consider an oolong because it's semi-oxidized, but all green tea back in the day was semi-oxidized. If you return to the sencha issue of Global Tea that we released last year, you'll see that the author Tyus also mentions that in his articles that back in the day, farmers didn't have the capacity because they didn't have machinery. They didn't have the capacity or the manpower to process the tea immediately to get it through the de-enzyming so that it would slow or halt the oxidation. And so all green tea had a little bit of a like very, very, very subtle oxidation, like a striped green tea or a baozhong, something like that. So this tea was more produced similar to that. So it's a little bit bigger and coarser leaves than probably what you're used to in sencha today. It has excellent storage, so it's kept very clean, and it's more than just an interesting tea. It's actually really, really good, which brings us to another point, which is a question that often comes up, which is, can we age any tea? People ask this very often. Is it just pu'er? Is it, some people don't even know about aging oolong, which is, understandable. It's a little bit, it kind of fell a little bit out of fashion for some time, and now it is coming back. But it is something that people have always done, aging oolong. The short answer is you can age any tea, and any tea will improve with age. That's a fact. That doesn't mean that aging is like some magical spell that is going to turn a low quality tea into a high quality tea just by leaving it sitting around. There are some teas that are just old, and they're not great just because they're old, right? So you have to start with a decent tea and age it. One of the things about aged teas that makes them special, though, is that they come from a time when the environment was clean, the earth was clean, there was a lot less agrochemicals and pollutants in the air and pollutants everywhere, in the water, in the mountain, a lot less, just cleaner, more natural production. And so that can be inviting. But different teas age different ways. You can, in our magazines, if you want to pursue this more deeply, there's basically two kind of processes. One is fermentation and one is oxidation. Like teas like pu'er are oxidizing and fermenting as they age. But teas like oolongs or green teas are just oxidizing. The reason that you don't see a lot of aged green tea is, I would say, for a few reasons. First of all, green tea does have a magic when it's fresh. There is, like, light oolong, baozongs, green teas. There is something magical about them when they're fresh and young, and there's a vibrancy to them. They're often made from all buds. This one isn't, but many are, and so they have that yang of spring, and there is a magic to that freshness. The other issue is water content. So this is also why lightly oxidized oolongs are not as great of candidates for aging as traditionally processed oolongs, which have more oxidation and/or roast. And that's to do with the water content. First of all, that means that the tea that you're aging here in Taiwan, especially, could have mold problems, which is common for loose leaf teas, especially with high water content. But it also means that because of the Kilgreen stage, which when we talk about the processing of tea and we talk about the saching, we talk about arresting oxidation, but it doesn't arrest oxidation. That's not possible. It just slows it down to a real trickle. But for practical purposes, we say that the saching stops oxidation. Because lightly oxidized oolongs and green teas have such a high water content, before they can really start oxidizing in a transformative way, they will have to dry out. And in order for that to happen in a way that won't spoil the tea, they have to dry out very slowly. And during that drying process, our experience is that they are kind of awkward. They have lost the freshness. This is the stage where a lot of people would unfortunately throw away their green tea, because they've lost the magic of that freshness when they're freshly plucked, and they're not magical or aged, or like, it's not like pu'er. Pu'er kind of has like 7-year cycles, and each one is kind of interesting. The stuff, it's interesting when it's young sheng. It's interesting in that first cycle. It's interesting in the second, and they're all unique and worth exploring. There's a lot of interest. But green tea and lightly oxidized oolong, they just have a long period of awkwardness until they're fully dry, down to a level that the oxidation can really start to kick in the change, and that cellular breakdown that results in aging. But once you do get a well-aged green tea, they are amazing. This tea is amazing. First of all, it brews up like a dark brown black liquor. It's the equivalent of like an aged pu'er, and it's delicious and super fragrant and unique. There's nothing like it. You'll be blown away. And this one's aged really well. It has very clean storage, so it's a really nice find. They tend to not be so patient as other aged teas, so don't expect it to like have as many. By patient, I mean how many steepings that you can get. Don't expect this to have as many steepings as like an aged oolong or an aged pu'er. But aside from that, I was amazed. I was interested in this tea just for the sake of education, letting you guys buy this tea just because most of you have probably never tasted an aged green tea, let alone an aged sencha, and let alone one that we can actually date so we know how old it is. Like all of that is, as a teacher, that's just magic that, you know, because I want to teach the things that I myself want to learn. I feel like, you know, like that with the magazine. So often what I translate for the magazine are the articles that I myself want to read, and I just hope that you guys, being tea lovers and tea geeks like me, that you'll be as interested in reading the stuff that I want to read as I am. So this is a tea I'm very interested in learning about and learning from. So, you know, I wanted to share it with you guys as well, just on an educational level. But I actually was a little bit blown away by its quality. It's not the best tea I've ever had, of course, but it is a really, really good example of an aged tea, period, let alone an aged green tea. The reason I wouldn't suggest getting into aging green teas is because we all have limited space. And because of that long, awkward period, the fact that it takes a long time to get to a tea that's really, really, really enjoyable. And, you know, there are some exceptions to that. It depends on the green tea, because there are some green teas that have lower moisture contents and that do start aging quicker and that are nice without having to pass through that awkward phase. But for the most part, that holds true. And so, you know, investing that space to store that tea for such a long time to get it to the place where it would be really enjoyable to share with your friends and enjoy yourself, most of us, because our space is limited, it would be better for us to use that space for oolong or pu'er or black teas. By black tea, I mean black tea, not red tea. So like liu bao or, you know, qianliang tea or liu an or something like that, or pu'er or oolong. Which one you would want to fill that space with would, of course, depend on many factors, including where you live and what the humidity is like and all that kind of stuff. But I think your experience, if you have like a, you know, whatever, a shelf, a cabinet, a room, 2 rooms, whatever you have to store tea, you know, will determine what kinds of teas you store. If the more space you have, the more you might want to experiment. We have some experiments going on here with aging some green teas. We have a lot of space. We have warehouse space to store tea. So if you have that much space, then it makes sense to experiment, and it's okay to take up some space and age a tea for a long, long time and see what happens. But if you're limited, then you probably want to put teas that you can enjoy maybe sooner, that will age well where you live, and that, you know, won't have to pass through such an awkward phase. And as I said, also, there is a real reason to drink green teas when they're young as well, because there is a magic to them when they're fresh and young and vibrant, etc. So more of what you're going to find in terms of aged green teas is things that just happen to be left around. And so the finding of this one with a data point, once again, isn't as useful as finding like Disco and being able to use that to map oolongs, which most often don't have a vintage. So it's good to have points of reference that you can say, well, this one is certainly younger than Disco, right? And this one's certainly older than Disco. So you can, because you have the experience of knowing the date of Disco, you can start to know the dates of teas that are unknown. Same with pu'ers and things, right? But we're not going to be drinking lots of aged green tea, so this doesn't really work that way, nor is it like a standard for how to age tea, which would be the other reason for having those kind of teas where we know the date, is we can learn what happens to tea as it ages, and et cetera, learn about storage. But it's still really cool that it does have a date. And so some of those things still do apply, just not as specifically, because there is also a way of like just stepping back and understanding the way that teas age, all tea. Of course, pu'er ages very differently than oolong. And of course, liu bao ages different than both of those. But there is a way of stepping back and drinking lots of samples of different aged teas and understanding the way that tea changes over time, because there are some things that are universal in that process of aging. So it's a very interesting tea. There's a lot to learn from it. there's a lot to explore, and you know, it's rare. It will be limited, so you know, we won't. I don't know how long we'll have it around because there's just what there was, this small batch of it. But we wanted to share it with you guys and share this video. Even if you don't get this tea, hopefully this video inspires you to explore some more avenues and areas of tea that you didn't think about, or to think about aging tea in different ways, or to go read more and learn more, find old issues in the magazine and explore old articles. Our intention with these videos isn't to give answers, but to inspire exploration and inspire experimentation and research and understanding and all of that, so we all grow and learn about tea together as this journey unfolds for all of us. Thank you so much for all your support. All the tea and teaware that you buy from us brings us all one step closer to our future free tea center, Light Meets the Life. We'll see you in the next video.